Okay, so welcome back to KG and Associates on this. We've had this other storm heading our way and lots of snow out there, but it's so great to see the sun today. I'm sitting with my associate, Janice D'Souza, and we have a really important topic today. And I'm going to be talking to Janice about her background and where she's come from, because although we've known for a long time that therapists working in the field of mental health has to include as part of our comprehensive assessments, we always ask about the culture, the society, the family philosophy, the family values. It's just an important part of when we're trying to get that comprehensive view of our clients so that we can be more useful to them. So we always included that, but I want to really, we have the benefit of hearing from you, Janice, today, what your background is and your travels into Canada with your family, and what the mental health perspectives are in that South Asian community. And really, we have to talk about how does this inform our work so that we are hitting the nail on the head with these clients and being the most useful we can be. So welcome back. And so tell me a little bit, why don't I just open it right up to you about where have you come from? Where has your family, where have the generations in your family come from? And any kind of pieces of that you think are important for our listeners to hear.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. I'm very excited to, to do this podcast today.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, my family comes from India originally, for generations as far back as I can remember. So in my family, there's my mom, my dad, and a younger brother. So we left India when I was about 5 years old. We had immigrated to the States first, and then 3 years later, we came to Canada. So, a lot of that piece, my brother and I were pretty much raised with the Western culture in a Western society because we were very young when we moved. But a lot of what I noticed in the family was just kind of navigating those differences with our parents or with uncles, aunts, and the older generation because they were raised in India where the culture is very different. Um,
Right.
and, speaking on mental health primarily, I could really see those differences growing up, like in terms of what my parents' opinions were on certain things versus what my brother and my opinions were on certain things. And I think like the fact that we were raised here, like even speaking with peers who were born and like their entire family has a very Western view on mental health or society, you could really see those differences. And I think my brother and I had that opportunity of learning from others, whether that was in school or just growing up here. So we were very we were blessed to be in a space where it was so open-minded, where we could teach our parents things as well. But I think it was a little like tougher for my parents to kind of understand everything we were kind of bringing to them or even like understand certain notions. Um, and just kind
Yeah.
of
So you were
stemming,
so young when you came over. So do you even remember living in India?
I don't, but because we've gone back to visit so often, since we've moved, I kind of like I'm still very like in touch with the culture and
Yeah,
all of that. Yeah,
exactly, exactly. And your brother, is he older or younger than you?
he's younger.
So he was even younger than 5 when you came here, when you
He
came to
was like,
US.
oh, maybe 1 years old.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So I want to hear more about that because we hear this from clients a lot in terms of the immigration experience and the immigration depression that can
Hmm.
happen, and then it's so profound when parents are here, whether it's the language barrier, whether it's the displacement of happening of their network, but then how that's juxtaposed against the children's experience.
Hmm.
And what I sometimes hear is the role reversal that can happen with children taking care of parents and whatever comes out of that emotionally and
Hmm.
mentally and socially, but also the division in the family because parents come with all of these high hopes of creating a better life for their children. And then their children's lives go in such a different direction. It's a bit mind blowing to the parents. So what happened for your family in all of that?
Yeah, so I think for there were definitely pieces in like high school and early university where it was almost like, okay, we're coming from an Indian culture, but we're also raised in a Western culture, and sometimes just like almost the mindset or the perspectives on like how we look at elders or how we look at certain things would kind of differ in those ways. So I think like just that struggle of like where does our identity lie, because we're a mix of both. Really, we bring in
Right.
that mix of both. So a lot of times it was like, okay, you know, this is how I think about certain situations, but I know culturally this is how we're raised to think about it. So
Right, right. We often hear that with mixed race people,
yeah,
right? That say, I'm not this, I'm not that. I'm not East Indian or South Asian, and I'm not Canadian. And I don't, did you have that experience growing up that, or did you feel like you had best of both worlds, or did you feel like you didn't fit in either world?
I honestly personally feel like I had best of both worlds. And I think that was just primarily like I kind of had that self-awareness piece where like I was very in tune with the culture, but I also recognized areas where I wanted to grow. I didn't want to be so trapped in like cultural mindsets or like how things were always done. So I would like want to be challenged and even take that back to my family, whether that was like in terms of mental health, dating, school, like, you know, going into STEM programs versus other fields. So I think a lot of that was navigated. And in all honesty, and I spoke about this in a different podcast as well, a huge thing is when immigrant families come here, there's that expectation that their kids will be doctors or engineers,
Mhm.
lawyers, you know, all of those programs. But I remember telling like my entire family I want to do social work, like from very early on age. And initially, like a lot of uncles and aunts, they didn't really understand it. Like they were like, "Oh, like you know, is social work just like you're doing social services, you're doing it for free, you're volunteering," you know, like a very like different mindset. Whereas, because in India, there isn't a lot of emphasis placed on a role as social work or therapy or counseling.
Mhm.
It's upon almost looked down upon as a job, more so back then than now for sure. And also depends on what area in India you're living in, right? Because in rural
Right.
communities, it's still this way. But if you're like in the city where we're raised in Mumbai, something like that, it's more spoken about.
Right. So it sounds like your family was really open to you and your brother developing in the Western society, but yet the part of that either pressure from themselves or on you about building a better life in Canada or in the
Yes.
US, and what those traditional, you know, what would be considered conservative, I guess, occupations, that is kind of like a evidence of success, right?
Mhm.
That will
Exactly.
that will tell me that it was worth the immigration, and we, you know, and it's working the way they want. So then you come along and go, I want to be a social worker. And they're like, what? Like, what is that?
Yeah, it's almost like, where is that going to take you? And I'm like, no, I know where it's going to take me. Like, I know that this is such an important career. Like, it's gonna go a far way. But what I really liked about what you said was, you know, they measure successes, and that's a huge thing in Indian or South Asian culture. It's very about the status and that appearance and measuring up to like, okay, like you know, this person in their family, they're all doctors. So that brought status as an
Oh,
example.
I
And
get
it's a
it.
very big thing of in Indian culture of like that presentation, like, okay, in my family we have this, like, you know, so that was a huge part of it. And so that's why your point on it is very important.
Yeah, I get that. So it's like, yeah, the measurement of a success, the evidence of success, and the appearance to other people about like the buy-in. The buy-in is that
Mhm.
doctors and lawyers are the succeed,
Yes.
you know, are the ones who are successful. So it's
Yes.
pretty amazing to me that you would even think about being a social worker. Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, so my parents have always been very supportive for what me and my brother wanted to do. They've kind of always had this mindset where we'd rather have you guys do something that will make you happy because your heart will be in it. You'll actually care enough to do it as opposed to us just forcing you to do something. And I remember even like initially when I did want to get into even my master's of social work, like I would just like educate my parents really, and they were open to listening to that
Mm.
part. Like I would educate them on like why is it so important that I want to be a social worker, or where does it stem from for me? Why is it so important? And they were always very understanding. So it really wasn't like a hindrance in terms of my parents. They were always pretty open in that sense. Um, and I think a huge part comes from that education piece and that awareness. The more you see, the more you talk about with peers, coworkers, the more aware you're of
Well, good
these
on
kind of things.
them, right? Good on them. It almost sounds like they were a bit of an anomaly in your community in terms of the openness they gave you and your brother, and the choices that allowed you to explore, right? You felt that freedom
Yeah.
to explore. So let's take what, that's great that that's happening or has happened, but it's like, what is going on with mental health, and obviously we're generalizing here, but what do you think
Mhm.
we need to keep top of mind in serving members of the South Asian community, and how mental health is seen? Because if, I guess, initially you're saying it may not be a measurement of success, and does that mean that mental health isn't valued or seen or visible enough, or what kind of assumptions or conclusions are placed on that?
It definitely goes hand in hand. In like, yes, like you said, we are generalizing, but in the Indian culture, even in the South Asian culture, mental health is seen as a big taboo still. It's almost seen as a stigma. And, I'd even use the word shame. So that's why it comes hand in hand, because it's almost like that view of perfection. If you have a mental health issue, or if you are depressed or you have anxiety, it takes away from that perfect status. So
Oh,
alongside with, what career are people doing, it's also about how are people presenting themselves, so it's almost very non-existent. Like if you bring up something like depression, it's almost looked as like, well, why do you have that? Like your life is so great. What are you, essentially, what are you depressed about? Aren't we enough for you? You know, Stuff like that. So it is in the culture, it is very frowned upon, I'd say, in some areas, and it's not as open to talk about. Absolutely not.
yeah, that you're saying so many important things. My mind is kind of swirling in terms of, I'm thinking of my own clients, from minority communities, and the struggle they go through in finding the courage to come forward for therapy, going against that family narrative. But I'm also thinking of the parents and the previous generations, and what that means in terms of their own journey. Because if they had
Mhm.
to be perfect, and if any sign of like emotional struggle internally was seen as
Yes.
weakness, or like the imperfection that they couldn't tolerate, then I guess it just gets shoved down and not really managed or dealt with, and then you're just pushing on. But makes me so worried, because I know what that can do over time, whether we get sick,
Yes.
or whether it comes up in displaced emotional outbursts, or whatever can happen. It can really take us off track. But if that whole thing is unconscious because I can't tolerate
Mhm.
accepting it or facing it, what that means, and then what that means for the next generation. So this whole perfectionism narrative sounds like it's a really big part of this whole piece.
Yeah, and like this is where that intergenerational trauma really steps in. And it's such a huge piece because, like you said, like even my parents or their parents, a lot of things that happened back then, or even if they were depressed or anxious or had, a mental health issue, it wasn't spoken about. It wasn't a thing to like go to your parents and have conversations about. It wasn't like, oh, I can go see a therapist to talk to someone about this. And a lot of things that they experience, they bring on as parents, unknowingly for sure. But
Right,
it's like those
right.
repeated patterns repeat. And the difference is now that our generation, we're a little bit more aware. We question things, we have these conversations. So sometimes when like we even take it back to parents, whether that's on mental health, sometimes older generations, they almost look at as, why are you challenging us? Like, things have been this way all along.
Yeah,
It's
they take
like
it
now,
personally, right?
yes, it's
It's like
like, are
what
you
you said a
saying
few
we weren't
minutes ago.
okay? Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, we aren't. So there's that whole piece of like the need for perfectionism, but then if you're bringing them to something to them that is imperfect, then they personalize it, like, what's wrong? Like, why aren't we enough? What did we do
Yes.
wrong? Oh my gosh, the tragedy of all that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've noticed this a lot with like children of immigrant parents as well. There is some sort of underlying pressure to kind of sacrifice your own personal like feelings or like desires for the expectations of family a lot of times because of that ongoing pressure. Like, my family has worked so hard to bring us to a country like Canada.
Yeah,
They have taken
yeah.
any job possible. They've struggled so much. So I don't want to burden them with, all of this that's going on in my mind. It shouldn't be a thing. It shouldn't be a priority. And a lot of times that's also why it's not spoken about, because we almost just flush it or like, put it under the rug to meet
Yeah,
those expectations.
the phrase that comes to mind for me is double perfectionism, right? Like,
Yes.
double, right? Because it's like we
Yeah.
have this narrative running in the background, and now we add the whole layer of the immigration experience, which then almost cements that need for perfectionism, because now I have to almost like be evidence to my parents that all the immigration was worth it, right?
Hmm.
That everything they wanted, I will emulate, I will live,
Yes.
even if it's not what I want. I have this pressure to please, right? To
Yes.
please my parents, to make sure that they
Hmm.
can feel good about all the sacrifices they made for me are paid off.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then running through all of that is this stigma of mental health. Holy, it's like two layers of perfectionism
Yeah.
with mental health weakness like running through the middle. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of times these pressures, they do, whether mental health issues were already there or like pre-existing and then it kind of worsens over time because of all of this, or it stems up, but then it's still not talked about. And I think that's where it gets very heavy for, a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think in our business, we see the clients that somehow step out of that just enough to
Yes,
contact us. And it makes me think of all the people that don't, right?
yes.
All the people in the community that are suppressing, repressing, perfecting, denying, minimizing, that never reach out. It's a bit mind-blowing, isn't it? And yeah, I guess the more, I think where there's podcasts and books, people can kind of quietly explore these things in privacy. Maybe that's
Hmm.
helping. I'd like to think that's happening. um so what do you think we should be doing better at in terms of serving the South Asian community? Like what makes it easier, or yeah, easier for those clients to feel okay about having made that step and kind of broadening their perspectives?
Yeah, so I think right off the bat, Karen, something that I like about, you and I working together is that we have that multicultural approach. Because I come from a different culture and so do you. So like in the future too, like when people are setting up therapy and like bringing on different counselors, I think just having a good mix, because it's not just that like, okay, I can relate. So that's why it's also that we can learn from each other. So it's like almost like if you ever had questions about the South Asian culture, we can talk about that.
Yeah,
And you can like better serve those clients as well. But a huge portion of really with the work that we do, I think it comes from the education piece and that awareness. I think we need to do more of that in like encouraging people of the younger generation to also have these conversations with their parents, with older
yeah,
generation, with everyone. Because
yeah,
the more things are talked about, or like you said, heard on podcasts or seen on TV, the more that awareness builds and the more, there's that understanding that, okay, having a mental health issue is not wrong. So the more it becomes normalized, I think that's
yes.
the first step that's really important, because until that normalization doesn't come in, us doing our work as therapists, even if we bring in that multiculturalism, it won't do any good because people are still looking at it as a taboo.
Yeah, yeah. I heard last night on a coaching session, they said it's a wall, not a door, right? So if our purpose is to help people kind of move, like walk through their doors rather than hitting walls, right? So immediately we offer a culturally diverse team, right? And I see this, clients, no matter how educated or experienced we are, there is that immediate comfort
Mhm.
that comes whether I need to see a male, whether I want to see a female, or see somebody from my ethnic community. Then it's just an established minimal trust that starts right from the very beginning.
Mhm.
So I do love that idea, and I have more ideas about how to build our team to really to continue to be more diverse as we continue to
Mhm.
grow, because I think from the get-go there's a level of comfort, and yeah, and then how we teach each other like we're doing today, and the education piece, yeah, because I think the idea is to help the clients we serve feel okay about their problems, to
Mhm.
humanize and normalize, because although I suppose there are specific pieces that set each community apart or identify the specific struggles of each of those communities, I still believe there's a shared human experience, right?
Yes.
Of
Yes.
wanting to be seen, wanting to be heard, wanting to be worthy, wanting to feel productive, having some autonomy, feeling connected to the people in their life. I do believe, and as you know, I've traveled all over the world. And the reason I love traveling, or what really pushes it over the top for me, is to meet with the locals, right?
Mhm.
No matter where my daughter and I travel, we have these really intimate conversations with the locals to find out kind of on the ground, what are people dealing with, right? When we were in Vietnam, we met with a community, and as soon as the mothers of the community knew we were there, two white women appearing in their, Vietnamese
Right.
village, they came to meet us. And our National Geographic interpreter interpreted the conversations.
Mm.
What did they want to talk to us about? Domestic violence and addiction,
Mhm.
right? Here I am in this tiny little community in the middle of nowhere. And same when we were in the Middle East last year. As there's obviously a lot of issues in terms of women's rights, but to talk to the men of that community and understand where some of this was
Mhm.
coming from. Where am I going with this? I think we were talking about, yeah, what sets the different communities apart, but also what is the shared human
Mhm.
experience. So I think no matter what, we need to provide that safe space for people to share their unique
Yes.
stories, and then how we help them formulate that experience so that they can understand where they've come from and what they need. But I think what you're saying is we need to have a really clear eye on understanding, the legacy of mental health with the
Mhm.
South Asian community. Because although it's hard for most people to reach out for therapy, it's harder for people of that community, right?
Mhm.
It
Yes,
means even more,
exactly.
it sets
Yes.
apart even more those people that have that brave courage.
Yeah, and especially, even for the people that do reach out to us, I think that piece on, like, almost removing that shame piece for them, because I know that for a lot of people, it takes a lot. Like, there's a lot of things to consider before they even get that help, and even when they do, there's a little bit of that shame piece, like, "Oh, is something wrong? Why do I need help? Why am I feeling this way? Is it normal to feel this way?" So kind of removing that aspect, and also a lot for, like, the younger generation who do come from cultures like this, just letting them almost be able to separate aspects of their life, helping them recognize that their own personal experiences with mental health issues is their own. It isn't like, it doesn't define, like, how their parents were. It doesn't define their parents' love or their parents' expectations. Those things don't need to go together. They can be complete separate experiences. Like, yes, your parents did this for you. They brought you here. They love you, but that doesn't take away from your own personal experience of whether you are feeling depressed, whether you are feeling anxious, whether you've had trauma in your life and you need to speak to someone on it.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. So what this means is taking clinical skills that we always need to kind of be, aware of, and sharpen it even clearer for potentially, and I know we're generalizing, but for the
Mhm.
members of this community.
Yeah.
So shame, like helping them unpack all that shame of what it even meant for them to reach
Yes.
out for help,
Mhm.
and what that actually means, and how to kind of provide that safe platform, to already begin right from almost the beginning of unpacking that one down position
Mhm.
that they're in because they've reached out for help. But yes, the second piece I think is so important, what you're saying around the individuation, right?
Yes.
Because where there's enmeshment, where I've lost my sense of self, where I don't know where I end and you begin, and I'm serving people to meet their needs rather than mine, the failure to launch for that
Mhm.
younger generation, because that lack of sense of self, and all kinds of, complicated things happen when I'm part of that enmeshed bond,
Yes.
because of the lack of boundary and that separation, the autonomy, the independence that
Mhm.
comes from I am a good person, even if what I am striving for or doing in my life is so different than what you thought I should be doing.
Yes.
And that takes us right back to the shame, obviously, but in some ways it's separate too, because it's like,
Mhm.
how can I feel good enough forging
Yes.
ahead in a different path, whether it's about getting help on mental health, whether it's not
Mhm.
going into the STEM program, but going into the photography,
Yeah.
and how that separates, and how do I feel good enough, and how do I even talk to my parents about that, right?
Yeah.
Because um, those conversations are part of the therapy, right? In terms of how
Yes.
do I stand up for myself and face the possibility that that will displease somebody.
Yeah, especially in my culture, like it's a very collective approach where family is like at the heart of it all. There's a huge emphasis placed on community, family, like, and not just your immediate family, it's your extended family. And I know back home, especially, it's a lot about, okay, what does this person think? What will society think of us, if they find out my child is doing this and this? So I think
Yeah,
even in the approaches that we do take, keeping in mind that it's such a collective community that we also need to like going back to that education piece, like educate as a whole, maybe even encourage like, families to work together because I know like having that family support, which may not always be easy for like parents to do, but having that support if their kid is dealing with a mental health issue or any other issue, like you said, choosing a different career field, just kind of that education and emphasizing that support as a collective is so important as well in the work
right.
that
And
we do.
I'm listening to you going, isn't it great? Like there's such a good piece of that. I start to picture like families coming together for
Yeah.
meals and celebrations. And, you've told me about your best friend's wedding and your wedding. And it's like, and you hear about these like 4-day weddings, and everybody seems like to be having such a great time. So there's something so beautiful, right,
Yes.
about that family. I almost get shivers as I'm talking about it, because it's like there's something so remarkably beautiful about that. And so it's like we don't want to lose that in the work that we
Exactly.
do. It's not about divorcing the family in
Yes.
order to be good enough. It's about kind of capturing and
Hmm.
preserving that part of it, but at the same time finding some boundaries where I can maybe do things that you didn't think I should
Hmm.
do, but that doesn't mean I'm rejecting you. It doesn't mean I'm
Yeah.
blaming you. You didn't do anything wrong, but it's kind of an extension of all of that love that families are about. So I know we just have a couple of more minutes, but when I'm listening to you, the other question that comes to mind is like, how possible do you think it is in the work that we do, because we do systemic treatment, because we
Mhm.
see our clients, in these systems and networks, how possible do you think it is to involve South Asian parents in their child or teens therapy?
Yeah, so I like in all honesty, I think it's very, very tough. There are obviously like a huge portion of parents that are very open to it because they are open to the experience and they do want to learn more, whether that's like how to better communicate with, as a family or not. But it's very tough. And I think until that education piece doesn't come in, the more conversations aren't had. Um, it's almost because it's that mindset and that openness that needs to come forward when you're bringing parents into their teens or or young adults therapy, and it's that mindedness that needs to come with it, because I know I've heard stories in the past where people of Indian culture have tried it out, and the sessions would just be like, the dad who's the patriarch of the family would be like, okay,
Yeah,
now you're telling me that the way I've raised my child is wrong, the way I communicate is wrong, but I've been raised like this and everything's okay. And then it comes to those like, that's where that intergenerational piece comes in. And
yeah,
then those
yeah.
conflicts of like, okay, but why is it wrong to do things this way? Why is it wrong that I speak like this? So it is definitely a little tougher to navigate. And I say that only because of that open-mindedness piece that only comes with that more of the awareness and the education around it. I don't know if that
Yeah,
makes sense,
yeah.
but
No, it
yeah,
makes complete sense. I think the therapist would have to create a very different space. It reminds me of early on in my training where like 40 years ago, and I remember a very experienced therapist was talking at the time, and he was serving a Portuguese family.
mm,
I was doing more of the case management back then, and he was doing the therapy. And I didn't realize this, but he goes, "Oh yeah, this family's from the Azores. They're
mm,
not from mainland Portugal." And his inroad to helping, because at that point their child was in a high risk situation,
mm,
this therapist went to the liquor store and bought some wine that was from the Azores, and when he went to the family home, because he was doing therapy in the
mhm,
home, and I don't remember exactly what he said, but apart from bringing specific wine, he had enough knowledge to know about the different mindset that Portuguese people have on the mainland versus on the Azores. And that was his in with this father. Because as soon as the father realized not only the wine, but that he understood the history of the people on the Azore Islands, the respect that that father had. So I do think it really, I understand what you're saying, and maybe we hardly ever meet these parents. But the onus is on us. I was writing something, doing a piece of writing yesterday about the therapist's responsibility of creating that safe space. So the gentleness that would be needed with this patriarchal, client would almost be helping them come to the decisions themselves about what to do with the family. So I'm not, so we would be much less structured, I feel, with these families, where we would help the patriarch hear some of the information so that he can decide what is going to work for his family almost. But
yeah, exactly.
yeah. And so I think that that's important, to commit to. And the other thing is, I think I will close on this is, I remember years ago when I worked with my first business coach, and she said to me, Karen, I want you to kind of tabulate the number and calculate the number of clients you've worked with. And I'd never really thought of it this way. When I sat down to do this and I looked at, okay, how many years have I been practicing? I started thinking about the clients I never meet, the clients we never meet. For me at that time, I was thinking of all the families I help in terms of the parents and their couple relationship. And it just hit me so well that I had actually served the children of that family. And so I started including them. I started including them in my numbers because I knew that the work I was doing with the couples, how that helped the children that I never actually met. And you almost wonder, I started thinking about that as you were talking, because it's like, maybe there's all the parents that we don't meet in these families and what's happening for you, because probably you're seeing this probably in your own family, because how proud your parents have become of your journey as a social worker. And without kind of hitting them over the head with it, you are living a successful life, and maybe it's planting some seeds for them about their own mental health. So it's like the clients we never meet, and maybe this is how we serve the families as well. So
That's
that's
actually
my thought about that.
yeah, that's an amazing point. And like, I know we need to wrap up, but you're right. Like, it's because I've learned so much in school or like in this career and the experiences. When I do go back home and I share some of this, it really does get them thinking. And I've seen it, like they've grown so much too. They're like more open-minded about things. So that's what I mean. Like, the more we serve, the more these conversations happen. It's that almost like
It's the
complete
indirect
circle.
service. It's the indirect
Yeah.
service of the clients we never meet. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for bringing this and sharing your own personal history, and this will just illuminate, KG and Associates even more in terms of who we're serving in our multicultural communities. So you can, for anybody listening out there who may be part of that community or are hearing some things today about how we work, how we formulate, how we assess all of the different factors, and how we are so dedicated, right, to creating that safe space, no matter where you've come from. You can reach us directly at 647-985-0633. That's my direct phone number, with my email, karenrsw@yahoo.ca. We are on Spotify. We are on YouTube. Our website, karenrsw.com. And Janice, give our listeners your direct contact, because this might be even more important for this podcast today.
Yeah, absolutely. So my number is 416-316-7686. And you can also reach me by email at j6dsouza@gmail.com.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Janice. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Karen. You too.